in terms of can they effectively eliminate a military terrorist organization that has an ideology that drives it. In my view, we have a couple of examples that suggest, yes, they can. One was the Al-Qaeda in Iraq during the surge period when General Petraeus was given the mission to destroy Al-Qaeda as an effective organization. That was accomplished in 2007 and 2008 and reduced the level of violence by 90%. And also ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, particularly in the Trump administration, when he removed the restrictions that were being imposed on the United States military command structure by the previous administration, they were able to destroy ISIS as an effective organization, certainly in Iraq and Syria.
It does sound as though the Israeli ground forces are moving into further territory, ever further south in the Gaza Strip.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, they're wrapping up their operation in the northern part of Gaza. They have a little bit more to go there, and they've already began to displace the forces that are not involved in that operation in that final clearing into the south. And they've already, as you noted, started an air bombing campaign there as well. I mean, certainly, you put your finger on it. This is a very complicated operation. So our audience understands in most urban battles and conflict from World War II to the present, by the time the artillery guns get closer and the bombing gets closer to the city that's under attack, most of the civilians flee for all the obvious reasons. What makes this operation in Gaza so different is that by and large the people are in the cities themselves, one being held by Hamas and not being able to get out, and two others who are not being held by them cannot leave Gaza because there's no place to go. The Egyptians have refused to set up refugee camps on the other side of the border in the Sinai and refused to obviously open their gates. So here the civilians are trapped for those two reasons, and it makes this warfare certainly very different and certainly high casualty civilian producing, something that nobody wants to have, but nonetheless it is a fact.
And we've had continual warnings from the United States, which of course is one of the closest allies of Israel, urging them to do more to prevent civilian casualties. But I mean, the death toll and the number of severely injured, homeless, children left without parents is rising day by day, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, it is, certainly, and that is the case. And there's a lot of challenge here in front of the IDF. We at the Institute for the Study of War estimate that the Hamas has 5 operational brigades, and the equivalent of about one of those has been rendered ineffective in the north. So much of Hamas's fighting force and most of their leaders, although IDF has killed and captured more leaders than they expected to at this part of their campaign, but nonetheless, the majority of Hamas leaders are still alive. They're in the south, and the majority of their forces are there. So this is going to take some time to render Hamas ineffective as a terrorist and a military organization, which is the military aim that has been assigned to the Israeli Defense Forces. Very challenging to accomplish.
Do you think it is a realistic goal? Yes, Israel continues to repeat that its goal is to destroy Hamas, or at least to destroy it as a force that can inflict the sort of casualties that it inflicted on Israel back on October the 7th. And I mean, what you're saying is that despite the scale of the operation that they have launched, there are still significant numbers of Hamas fighters at large.
Yeah, very much so, and more than half of their rockets and missiles are still have not been used. So Hamas has been able in the number of years since Israel has been in Gaza with any consequential force has really been able to hide their military infrastructure by building considerably more tunnels, much more complex than what they've had in the past. And they protected a lot of this infrastructure, and they've obviously protected a lot of their people, which adds further complexity to this operation. The degree of the subterranean complexes that Hamas has, and does have in the south, by the way, quite vast ones, has added to the challenge, certainly, that the IDF is facing. Now, in terms of can they effectively eliminate a military terrorist organization that has an ideology that drives it? In my view, we have a couple of examples that suggest, yes, they can. One was the Al-Qaeda in Iraq during the surge period when General Petraeus was given the mission to destroy Al-Qaeda as an effective organization. That was accomplished in 2007 and 2008 and reduced the level of violence by 90%. And also ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, particularly in the Trump administration, when he removed the restrictions that were being imposed on the United States military command structure by the previous administration, they were able to destroy ISIS as an effective organization, certainly in Iraq and Syria. Not that they've gone completely, but in terms of their ability to do any damage, they were able to accomplish that. So, yes, it can be done, but it's going to take some time, and they will need support. I mean, I'm privy to the fact that there are ammunition shortages that the IDF currently has, and certainly the United States is one of the indispensable allies to assist them, as is the UK and others.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there are precedents for the scale of military operation, but I think I'm right in saying that in those conflicts that you talked about in Syria and Iraq, it was more possible for more civilians to leave to other parts of the country. I'm looking at figures. Now, these do come from Hamas, which runs the health ministry in Gaza. It is talking about 6,000 children and 4,000 women killed since the start of this Israeli operation. I mean, those are staggering figures in comparison to previous conflicts.
No, that's absolutely true, and that's when I mentioned that this is very unique. It's really quite unprecedented to have such a sizable population right in the middle of the battle zone. Our most recent examples in Ukraine, Mariupol, and at Bakhmut, and I'm sure your audience has seen videos of that. By and large, by the time the battle was joined in both of those cities, the civilians were largely all gone. And while there were certainly civilian casualties in the very preliminary stages, there was not extensive civilian casualties for that reason. In Fallujah, in Iraq, and also in Mosul, the same thing happened. By the time the battle was joined in the cities themselves, many of the civilians were gone. So that is what makes this operation so complex for the IDF and so devastating, obviously, the Gazan people.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the Hamas attacks of October the 7th were horrendous. But what people are seeing around the world now is week after week of pounding of Palestinians and that loss of civilian life, as we've just been discussing. Do you think that the United States is going to be able to continue to support this campaign as it goes on? When we've certainly seen protests in support of the Palestinians here in London, and there have been some in the United States as well. Is there any sign of wavering, do you think, from the Biden administration?
No, they're very much supporting the campaign, but they're also pressuring the IDF to minimize the civilian casualties as much as possible. I mean, if I had to draw a distinction, so maybe the audience would understand a little bit of the difference. In the United States, we're using air power against a facility, as an example. if we suspect at all that there'll be civilians in there, even if it's not our policy to warn infrastructure inhabitants that we're going to attack it. But if we believe there would be civilians, let's say we did warn them, and we still believe they were there, we would not attack it. That's just a fact. If we knew there were enemy soldiers in a building with civilians, we would not attack it. And we would make a decision. If we valued the building or if we needed to kill the soldiers, the enemy soldiers, then we would send in troops that are trained to deal with enemy that's inside a physical structure and may indeed be using the civilians to shield them and protect them. So we like your forces, are trained to do that very same thing, as is the IDF. So that's the difference in approach to this problem, and I think that is one of the things that the United States military advisors are trying to convince the Israelis to pull back on the air power campaign, the scale of it, and the lethality of it, and conduct more on-the-ground infantry operations. Of course, from their perspective, that will drive their casualties up much more so than what they are right now. They've been very light.
Yeah, I should say there are pictures on the front of the papers here in Britain of Binyamin Needham. He's a 19-year-old British soldier who's been killed in Gaza fighting with the Israeli Defense Force. He's a dual national who was in the Combat Engineering Corps 601st Division. And the paper has also been reporting, the Times has been reporting that there have been some 400 Israeli soldiers killed overall. But of course, that loss of life is much smaller than the loss on the Palestinian side. And we're hearing Israel talking about taking that offensive into all areas of Gaza. But is it clear what happens if and when it does ever reach the end of this? Is it clear how and whether it would hand over some sort of control of Gaza, and who would take on that role, General Keane?
No, I mean, listen, United States leaders, Israeli leaders, Arab leaders themselves, they have been some pretty serious discussions in terms of what would be the political entity to govern Gaza after this. The Israelis do not want to occupy it, but they will have to, for a period of time, to be sure to see transition through. That's assuming they're able to have success in their military operation that they've set up for themselves. But there's not agreement on what to do. And the obvious thing is that the Palestinian Authority, but the Arab states in the region, as well as the Israelis and the Americans, know full well that is ineffective, corrupt organization. But certainly one of the Americans' ideas is, well, maybe that's the place to start, and we revitalize them and help to reform them. But that's an aspiration. That doesn't exist now. So, yes, there's not a clear path ahead as of right now, but discussions are earnestly taking place on this very subject, and it is complicated. The Arabs don't want to put in their own forces to enforce it because they don't want to get into the role of having to police some of the radical Hamas youth that would be there and would be resisting their enforcement and wind up, having to harm them or harm their own troops. They don't want the optics of that taking place. The Israelis don't trust the UN, so they don't want any part of UN peacekeepers in there as well. So there is no solution yet, just a number of options that are being discussed by the parties involved.
General Jack Keane, chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, former Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.